I'm going to be talking about responsive design patterns. A lot of hype has been built up around responsive design, and rightly so. It's a really good solution for making a single code base work across multiple screen resolutions. We'll get into that a little bit, but I'm going to basically talk about mobile UX and all sorts of cool stuff. So, and I'm at NickRP on Twitter, if you'd like to follow me. I work for this really cool company called Treehouse. I am the Chief Content Officer there. Basically, Treehouse is an online school where you can learn web design, web development, mobile app development, how to start a business, and those are all the things that we're going to be talking about on the skills stage today, tomorrow, and the next day. You can check us out at teamtreehouse.com, so be sure to check us out there. So, like I said, it's no secret that there's been this huge explosion of screen resolutions, right? All across the spectrum of small mobile devices, all the way up to, you know, your big 27-inch iMacs. And a really good solution to this has been responsive web design. So if you're not familiar with responsive web design, it's basically a set of techniques where you can make a single set of HTML and CSS work across all of these different devices. And basically, the design will rearrange itself, kind of resize itself to work on that screen resolution. So this is a big deal because there's lots of mobile devices that can use HTML5 and basically render good-looking web pages. It's no longer an age where there's these crappy mobile phones that can't really render a good-looking website, right? So I guess this stat says in 2013 there will be about 1 billion HTML5 capable phones. So we're not really going to get too deep into the technicals of responsive design. This is going to be more a design UX talk. When I did my mic just go? Oh, there it is. When I think about UX, I kind of think about what kind of data you can gather about the user. So in most cases, you know what time it is, right? You can detect what kind of device they're using. You can draw on other APIs to maybe get, a couple of other peripheral pieces of information about them. And you can also use geolocation to figure out where they are. So from those pieces of information, you can start to kind of build up a profile of the person visiting your website or your web app. Who is this person, right? Where are they? What time is it? Basically, you're trying to figure out what their motivations are so that you can get them to the relevant information as quickly as possible. So put another way, data helps to contextualize the goal of your users. So let's say that the user had a goal of wanting to eat a quesadilla, right? So let's assume we're running this business that sells Tex-Mex food, right? And Tijuana Flats is a popular restaurant in, well, at least in Florida, which is where I'm from. And let's say that this person they're visiting Florida and they've been told about this restaurant and they're like, oh man, I got to check out that place, Tijuana Flats. So they go to Tijuana Flats website on their phone and it says, find your Tijuana Flats. Okay, so we want to figure out where this Tijuana Flats is. So that looks good. I don't know what Join Flatheads is, but we'll just move through here. okay, so we want to find this place, and I need to select my state. All right, I'm going to select Florida. And then I'll keep going through all these other steps where I have to select a city. And then finally, I get to this page of results where there's 9 locations ordered by, I don't know what, maybe distance. It's really pretty hard to tell. And it really doesn't give me any kind of clear indicator as to where I'm supposed to go next, right? And, oh, by the way, I don't know if you've been looking, but it's 10 o'clock at night, and they're closed. So why even bother let me get that far, right? Think about this as if it were a conversation, right? Say you called up a pizza place, and you said, hi, I'd like to order a pizza. And they'd say, okay, what would you like? Well, I'd like a large cheese and an order of breadsticks. And then they'd say, oh, well, we're closed right now. Why didn't you tell me that sooner, right? It's kind of silly when you think about it that way, but that's how I think about web apps. I think about them in terms of having a conversation to try and get to that piece of information that the user really wants. So let's take another goal. Let's say I want a donut, and I want a donut from Krispy Kreme. I'm going to go to their website. And when you go to the Krispy Kreme website, it asks for your current location. So they're using the HTML5 geolocation API, right? So we're using APIs to try and gather information. And immediately, you hit OK, and it says, all right, we found 4 Krispy Kremes near you. And you ready for this? 2 of them have the hot light on. Whoa. How do, you know, what an amazing experience. So basically, they were able to take these pieces of information and say, OK, we know where this person is. We can get them to the nearest locations quickly. We know what time it is. We know what places are open. We know they're using a phone, so they're on the move, right? We want to try and kind of narrow the experience down to something that's going to be immediately relevant to them. They're looking for a place. And then I don't know how they figured out how the hot lights were on, but maybe there's some sort of Krispy Kreme API that they're tapping into. Maybe it's just based on what time it is. But in any case, it doesn't really matter because they figured out what information I wanted right away and got me to it quickly. So it's a pretty cool experience. So when we talk about responsive design, we're really talking about web apps, right? We're not talking about native applications. But I think when you're developing for the web, you can borrow from these native experiences because users are going to develop behaviors and patterns that they start to get used to. And you can pretty easily steal things like colors, fonts, menus, the tonality of the copy, and basically create a more palatable experience that will onboard the user a little bit more quickly. So based on those 2 experiences we just kind of walked through, I feel like making something mobile means making it simpler and just getting to the information quickly, and not necessarily taking the full experience and just trying to narrow it down and cram it onto a device. In fact, in responsive web design, you're really supposed to design the mobile experience first. This is a movement that kind of happened midway through responsive web design's popularity called mobile first. So you design the mobile experience first, and then you can build up from there. So let's think about that for a second. So typically, you know, you'll have a website with maybe a footer, maybe you have a sidebar and a header, etc. And as you get down to smaller mobile sizes, you'll kind of start to get rid of elements, you'll start to combine them, etc. But when you come from a mobile first standpoint, you work your way the other direction. So this is the Boston Globe, which was very famously redesigned with a responsive mindset using mobile first. And they're going from this very simplified layout and then working their way up. So you'll see new design elements start to work their way into the design, right? So now we have more than just advertisements. We're starting to get kind of other pieces there. And then finally, it ends up looking like this. So in desktop layouts, we have a lot of good patterns. These are called design patterns. And that's kind of how I think about designing websites. You know, there's no use in completing something every time you have to build it. You can borrow from stuff that's already made. So when I say design patterns, I'm talking about tabbed interfaces, progress bars, photo galleries, etc. You see these all over the web. And these are very well-established patterns in a desktop layout. But they're not really all that well-established on mobile devices. Or if they are, there's not really a strong link between desktop and mobile. Or at least not yet. It's kind of in progress. There's this great place that Yahoo maintains where they have these design patterns that you can kind of go and look through and see things like pagination, friending people on a social network, etc. And that's pretty useful if you have to solve a particular design problem and you're like, I wonder how other people did this. So, but what does a responsive design pattern look like? So let's say you had that photo gallery, right? And this is what it looks like on a desktop layout. There's a couple of strategies that you can take to try and narrow that down. So the first thing that you might want to do is make it vertical, right? Because typically people will use their phones in the portrait format. Not often will you see people use their phones in landscape. They do sometimes, but generally you kind of have to narrow things down. The screen width is not nearly as wide as it is on a desktop. The next thing you have to do is kind of make things smaller, right? I think that's obvious. Something that might be less obvious to non-designers is to pay attention to the margins and padding. So you can take that same design and kind of squeeze it together, right? And so you have a little bit less of that negative space in between each of the elements. And eventually you have something that is relatively the same on both mobile and desktop layouts. So that's what it looks like there, and that's where it started out, right? So there's this really great library of responsive patterns that has been started by Brad Frost. And there's the really long URL for it. Let you guys go ahead and check that out. But I highly recommend you take a look at this. It's basically a library of exactly what I was talking about. Patterns where you can go ahead and see what it might look like on a desktop, and then you can go ahead and resize your browser and actually narrow the width and see what that same thing looks like on a mobile device. Of course, these are just suggestions or common patterns that are present across many websites. It's not some sort of standard that you necessarily have to use. But anyway, yeah, that's pretty much my talk, trying to get us back on schedule. But if there's any questions right now, I'd be happy to answer them. You can ask me about responsive design patterns. You can ask me about Treehouse. Yeah?
Responsive design. I started seeing like articles saying that maybe anything against it.
So the question was basically, there's a backlash against responsive design occasionally, right? And sometimes it's not always appropriate to use it. I agree. I don't think that responsive web design is the end-all, be-all way that you should build websites. I mean, I think it's definitely the default that you should think about going into a new project. You should assume that, yes, this is going to be a responsive site. But I think you should definitely consider the needs of your site visitors. And so, of course, if you don't use a responsive design, the alternative is to build a separate mobile site. So you're maintaining 2 different code bases, or maybe even 3 if you're doing like something in between for tablets. I think that there definitely are cases where you might come up with a very specific set of conditions or reasons why you would want to build a customized experience for that site. For example, if you really want to try to mirror, say, a native app. So let's say you have a native app and you just kind of want to mirror that experience in the mobile or on the mobile web, then yeah, that might be an okay-ish reason to go ahead and do that. If you're really trying to just onboard people into the native app, just say, hey, this is what you could be experiencing only faster if you go ahead and download our app. There's probably lots of cases you could come up with for designing a separate mobile site. But yeah, I think most of the time you should go with a responsive design. You have to have a pretty good set of reasons not to. Hey, we have a mic.
I was wondering if the responsive design had any negative effect on page load speeds, because I know there's like a lot of media queries involved and everything.
So the media queries don't actually take away from page load time. There might be a little bit of repainting, but it's fractional. In fact, that's something I'm going to talk about on Wednesday. We talk about front-end performance. But, I don't think it's a whole lot different, really, from building a site normally. And basically, if there's something else wrong. So, no, it shouldn't take away from your page load times. So you shouldn't be building up a dramatic amount of CSS in addition to what you would normally need. It should basically be small modifications to what you already have, working your way up to a desktop layout. So, basically, you should have the same amount of CSS in general. You just should kind of section it off based on media queries. So, yeah. No, it shouldn't be a huge impact front-end performance. Yeah.
Can you have some comments on the Zerb Foundation and the Twitter Bootstrap or the Adobe Edge Reflow? And do you aware of any other tools also? Yeah, thanks.
Oh yeah, yeah. There's lots of CSS frameworks. That's almost an understatement to say there's lots. There's a ton of CSS frameworks, and if you're going into a new project, I would absolutely use a framework. Because Bootstrap, Zerb Foundation, there's so many that have all of that responsive functionality just built right in. And using a framework will really help you get a huge head start. Does that kind of answer your question? Which is better?
Or any experience you can give us? Yeah, some suggestions.
I would say, Bootstrap and Zerb are pretty awesome. There's tons out there. Really, it depends on the project. I wouldn't get too hung up on it, though. I would just kind of try them out and see which one works best, because a lot of times it comes down to personal preference. I think a lot of times people will get hung up on things like that that really don't matter. Like a lot of, particularly beginners, will get hung up on like which text editor they should use. It's important, but at the same time, it's kind of like asking like which notepad should I use to take notes in class? Like, it doesn't really matter. That's not really the essence of what you should be focusing on. I think, you know, if you're picking a CSS framework, just try a couple out. Just, you know, build a project with one, and if it doesn't work out, just pick another framework the next time. I mean, they're all usually pretty good, you know, so you're not going to like shoot yourself in the foot by picking the wrong one.
In your opinion, what are some bad examples or some examples of bad design patterns that are still widely used that we should stray away from as designers?
Bad design patterns. Well, I mean, there's no shortage of bad design.
I know, something that's widely used, though. I guess that maybe the trend is staying away from these designs now.
Right. I can't think of one off the top of my head. I mean, usually bad design comes from, well, it comes from a lot of things, but when you see a bad design, they're usually not really using a whole lot of patterns, or they're using a pattern in a very incorrect fashion. I think it's really the usage of design patterns itself that could mess you up. So, for example, if you are designing something using a pattern and you use it in the wrong way, you're kind of going against that learnt behavior. I think, actually, I see this most commonly with pagination, you know, where you have like the little numbers at the bottom of like search results or something, and you're kind of clicking through. I think I've seen the most variations of that out of really anything I can think of. So a lot of times it can be hard to know, like, what's that double arrow going to do? Is it going to take me to like the 10th result there? Is it going to take me to the last one? It's, you know, it's sometimes hard to tell. I would say just if you're going to use a design pattern, which, you know, you should, make sure that you're not going against a lot of established behavior. Yeah.
So for layout in general and on mobile, you have a lot of gestures and for data input. How do you manage designing for mouse and keyboard and something that's pretty much gesture oriented?
That's a tough question. I guess really the first rule there is to not rely on the hover state or the hover pseudo class, because, you know, if you create some sort of design where it relies on the user hovering over to kind of understand the functionality and what's going on, that's not going to work on a mobile device where you don't really have a hover state. But that's really an ongoing conversation because it keeps changing. It's a moving target, basically. And I think it's going to evolve even further because you have stuff like Google Glass, you know, the rumored Apple iWatch. I mean, who knows what that's going to do to touch devices. I think the thing to pay attention to in that case is actually semantics of HTML, because I think what's going to happen as we start to see more and more of these mobile devices that kind of don't really fit the categories that we're used to, like phones or tablets, I think we're going to start to have to rely on semantics a little bit more heavily, because they could potentially reinterpret HTML and we won't have the same kind of experience on a desktop that we're used to, you know? So it's a good question. Answers, I don't know. Yeah.
I've seen a lot of people saying that when building a mobile website, you shouldn't like take chunks of information or features off you should that's just a new way for displaying it. But I keep seeing lots of websites building it and taking off pieces of features, little features and pieces of information for the sake of, I don't know, quick information availability. What's your opinion on that? Like you have to press go to standard view to get the full thing.
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, I think, so the question is basically like, if you're creating a mobile experience, do you remove features for the sake of simplicity? So do you remove features from, say, your desktop experience to help users get to information more quickly? I mean, I don't think there's a blanket answer for that applies to every web app. I think the answer is really it depends. I think it depends on what the goals of the app are. I mean, what is, and it also depends on the context. So like I was saying, you can figure out quite a lot of information just by looking at like geolocation, what time of day it is, what type of patterns of behavior has this user followed historically. I don't think you should just remove features for the sake of laziness, but if you're trying to create a more focused experience, one solution might be just to downplay those features, maybe kind of push them off to the side and say, well, if you really want to do that thing, here you go to this menu, you go to this thing, and here it is, and you can do it there. I see a lot of apps kind of follow that pattern, but it's tough because as soon as you include a feature on the desktop version, people are going to start having that expectation and say like, I can't do this on my phone. I have to, I think the answer is it depends, though. It really depends on the app and the context.
Anyway, I know that Brad Frost recently wrote an article about the post-Photoshop era, and Elliot J. Stocks also wrote an article 2 days ago. A lot of the resistance to responsive design is from designers, and especially within agencies, because they're used to the waterfall method, like turning in a bunch of comps. But I just want your comments on, we're designing for devices that haven't even been created yet, and how do we re-educate the clients that are expecting to see the pixel perfection, and you can't just do like 800 comps.
So that's a great question. So traditionally, websites have been designed with pixel perfection in mind, very similar to the way you might design a magazine or a newspaper, right? Where you come from the print world, where everything is supposed to be laid out exactly so. There's a physical manifestation of the design, and that exists in the real world. It's not going to have like arbitrary dimensions. Nobody would go to print a magazine or create a magazine article or content and say, what size is the magazine? And they're not going to tell you like, well, I don't know. I mean, it kind of changes from day to day. Like, that would be crazy. But that's the reality on the web. So I think it's just going to take time to re-educate clients and basically say like, hey, this is different from the real world. You have to think in terms of percentages or ratios, basically, instead of thinking in terms of pixels. So one way to think about it might be like, how prominent do you want this element to be versus this other thing? And maybe create a list of priorities before you actually start doing the design. Because usually, you list out the things that you think are going to be on the page and then kind of lay them out. An interim step might be to actually prioritize those with the client. Say like, well, how big should each piece be there? Because that's going to change in terms of physical pixels, but what you can control is the ratio across devices. So I think we had a
actually had a question come in about when designing for mobile, do you work with a content strategist to decide what content should or should not be included?
Maybe, in some agencies. I don't really know. It depends on the size of the company, if you have a content strategist or not. You could. I don't know.
Would it help?
Probably. Sure. I mean, it always helps to have another set of eyes, right? I think you have to be careful when talking about the difference between content strategy and UX, you know, 'cause it can really get pretty muddled. I think the content strategist might serve the role of, say, a client, like I was saying, to determine what should actually be important on the page. But in terms of actual design, I'd be careful.
Yeah, I imagine you want somebody there on behalf of the user. Like, what are the user's expectations that they would want on the mobile? Whether it's the client specifically, or a strategist, or
yeah, what did he say?
Hi, yeah, this kind of dovetails into that. My question, is the placement above, below the fold more or less important than when such considerations are done on a traditional desktop site? Because, of course, the fold will vary based on the mobile device.
So we've been talking about that internally at Treehouse because our basic HTML and CSS courses get the most views. Actually, so we have 13 teachers at Treehouse, and I account for 20% of the views on the site, which is pretty weird. So we're all talking about, like, well, is that because the web design or HTML stuff is above the fold? Or is it because most people need to learn that? Or, you know, I don't know. I'm not sure what the answer is. I don't think the fold really matters nearly as much as it used to, particularly when users are already engaged in an experience, they're already on a website, they're kind of scrolling, looking for information, they have a specific goal in mind. I think the fold does matter if you're talking about landing pages and a marketing page where, like, you really need to, like, get to the information quickly and say, like, here's the general idea and here's a picture of it, and bam, you know. So it's 12 o'clock. If I wrap up now and go on to the next talk, we'll actually be back on schedule. So, but are there any more questions for me? One more?
I have a quick question. So the layout, does it depend on device type, or does it depend on the screen size?
I don't think it depends on the device type much at all. I think it really just depends on the screen size. I mean, technically speaking, when you're building a responsive design, it relies totally on the screen size. It doesn't rely on, like, you know, device sniffing or anything like that, because there's always going to be new devices. So, you know, responsive web design is a way to kind of future-proof the design, so when the new Android phone comes out with a slightly different width of pixels, you know, you're ready for that device immediately. So, yeah. All right. Well, cool. Thanks, everybody.